Well, fantastic. Thanks everyone for joining us today. It's right on the top of the hour, so we're going to get started. Today's webinar is all around really the 15 best cybersecurity practices small organizations like yours can practice. And this is actually really general great practices for any type of organization. And as we get into it, really organizations that store a lot of personal identifiable information. So law firms, financial firms, medical organizations, even marketing agencies that deal with a lot of data for their clients. Super important for you all to have these best practices in your arsenal of combating cybercrime and also just having the best cybersecurity practices in place. So fantastic. Couple introductions. My name is Taylor Wells. I'm the Director of Marketing for NWTECS. Our focus at NWTECS is helping organizations never spend money on technology without a measurable business outcome. So what that means is helping organizations really utilize technology to drive business outcomes. If it doesn't increase revenue, reduce costs, or reduce risk, we don't help you implement it. If you're interested in other webinars from us, you can go over to our website, nwtecs.com/webinars. We have a huge catalog and archive of webinars on Microsoft 365, other cybersecurity related webinars, best practices in managing your IT, business phone systems, and cybersecurity. Before we jump into the content, a couple housekeeping items. This will be recorded, and slides and a copy of the recording will be available in the next 24 hours if you want to share this with a colleague or rewatch any of the information. We'll also have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So please, if you have questions, please message them through the Q&A portion of the Zoom link. If you're watching this live on Facebook or YouTube or LinkedIn, you also can submit a question in there as well. We'll try to respond to it. And we're also responding to all your questions you submitted live in your registration form. So all those questions around cybersecurity, we're going to answer those as well at the end of the presentation. If you are interested in getting more help, we will have details on a free cybersecurity assessment we can take you through to make sure you are, see if there's any gaps in your cybersecurity program. Fantastic. Let's jump right in. First, I want to share this quote with you that I thought was very insightful from Robert Mueller, the former FBI director in 2012. He said, "I'm convinced that there are only two types of companies, those that have been hacked and those that will be. And even they are converging to one category, companies that have been hacked and companies that will be again." And so this isn't supposed to be some fear-mongering statement from the former FBI director, but it's really around an awareness that this is facing every organization. Now, your organization may not be hit with ransomware, like maybe one of the larger companies like Colonial Pipeline or JBS, which we'll talk about later. The current attacks we'll talk about later as far as what can we learn from them. But you might be hit with a credit card scam or a spoofing or a email compromise scam, right? Where somebody gets your email account and then uses it to perform scams. So there's a whole gambit of types of hacks and breaches your company can experience, and they all have effects on your business operations, on the credibility of your organization, and also just liability in general. So to frame kind of what is the most important aspect of cybersecurity. So when we go through these 15 practices, you can understand really what is the most important thing you should be focusing on, and that is PII. PII stands for personal identifiable information. This industry term is referred to any personal sensitive data that your organization holds. This could be a full name, social security number, credit card information, driver's license, bank account information, password, and even an email address. So this is all considered PII, and it's kind of a term used for this is sensitive data. If your company is storing this for yourself, and especially for clients, this is really the most important thing you should be looking at to protect. Obviously, there's lots of other scams out there that are related to, like, wire transfer scam and email impersonation scams and all those other types of things, which are really important, which we'll talk about as well today. But when we talk about what's the most valuable piece of information, it's really your data. That's what's most valuable, especially the larger you get, and especially if you're in a regulated industry, right? Like I mentioned, financial services, medical organization, law firm, marketing agencies, really those four agencies, those four types of organizations hold the most PII. And so they are at the greatest risk. And we're seeing some of the most attacks with those organizations. So the goal is, hey, number one, make sure your PII is protected, whether it's where it's stored, whether it's encrypted, and we'll talk about that today. But then, also number two, making sure you're prevented and have prevention against other forms of attacks as well. Awesome. Let's go into a couple just trends and problems we're seeing. Number one was we're seeing a ton of innovation. Microsoft came out with a study that in the last, this was a couple months ago, but really in the past 16 months, we've seen about 10 years of innovation when it comes to technology. And so part of that is, the pandemic, right? We've all a lot of people have to work remotely, a lot more cloud-based infrastructures are in place. And people are just utilizing technology now more than ever. It's a beautiful thing. It's an awesome thing that we're able to work with people all around the world and have be so connected. But that also comes with some risk, right? We're now, instead of meeting in person, a lot of people are meeting online. And so just think about kind of the shift of where the culture has gone and the way the infrastructure has gone is that we're now utilizing technology now more than ever. And so that just creates more potential opportunities for cyber criminals to take advantage of that, right? So that's kind of number one. Number two is small businesses have the highest malicious email rate at 1 in 323. So out of all the emails that go to small businesses, 1 in 323 is some sort of malicious email, right? Whether it's a phishing scam or a malware, right? Getting you to download a file. So super important that small businesses, there's a misnomer out there that small businesses aren't affected by cybercrime, and it's mostly the enterprise companies. And that's just not true. And we'll show you kind of a couple of other studies as well, that small businesses, because they don't have the security that enterprise organizations have, but you still have the same issue, right? You're still dealing with personal identifiable information. You still have a ton of risk because it's not like, you're still trying to compete on a large level. You still have a lot of the same types of infrastructures and the same types of needs as an enterprise company, but you don't have millions of dollars to put into cybersecurity. Small businesses are targeted. That's kind of a side note for you there. Number three is the average cost of a data breach is $3.86 million. This is across small businesses, large businesses, and this is definitely a lot of ransomware related breaches cost. Number four, 43% of cyber attacks target small organizations. Another study here that almost half of the cyber attacks target small businesses. Number five, 98% of cyber attacks rely on social engineering. This is probably one of the most important statistics right here is social engineering. So this is, if you think about it from a cybersecurity standpoint, the criminal is not busting down the door. They're actually knocking on the door, the proverbial door, and an employee or a contractor or a vendor is letting them in. So what that means is a lot of social breaches, a lot of cyber crime is used, social engineering is used to complete cyber crime, right? It's not just somebody breaking into your server. It's you actually letting them in. And we'll talk a lot about ways to prevent social engineering in this webinar and best practices there as well. Number six is damage related to cybercrime is projected to hit $10 trillion annually by 2025. Phishing increased in 2020 to account for 1 in every 4,200 emails. So every email that's sent out on the web, out of 4,200, 1 is a phishing email. A phishing email is, I'm sure you've seen them, is where somebody is pretending to be a reputable company or person that you've interacted with before in the past to get you to click on a link that either downloads some sort of ransomware or malware or gets you to log into a fake login account, right? So for example, your bank A phishing email could be your bank, somebody impersonating your bank. It looks like your bank asking you to reset your password. You click on the link, it goes to a page that looks like the bank's page, but it's not. And then you give up your login and password. So phishing emails are super common. And we'll also talk about that today of how we can prevent that. Awesome. Let's jump into our first kind of best practice. Number one, and this kind of relates to social engineering. Does your organization provide regular cybersecurity training and testing to all your team members? So like I mentioned, 98% of cyber crime and breaches have some sort of social engineering element to them, right? Where a human lets a cyber criminal in. So one of the most important ways you can help your organization prevent cybercrime is to have training on it, to know what the current trends are, to know. And I've mentioned probably 5 or 6 types of cybercrime out there. There is literally hundreds of different types of cybercrime, and cyber criminals are by definition always trying to come up with something new to get into our organization. So the key here is to have some sort of cybersecurity training program that, and they don't have to be super complex. We do one for our clients, and I actually take it internally. I take it as well. I get regular testing, and we also have a phishing simulator, which I'll talk about later too, and an annual test. And basically it keeps you aware, right? It's constantly keeping me aware of the current trends out there, what to look for, right? As far as different types of cybersecurity breaches, but then also best practices, right? When you're traveling, what type of things should you do? Let me think of some other ones we've done recently, some other tests we've done recently. When you're traveling, what should you do? How to handle your personal Wi-Fi at home, using public Wi-Fi, kind of all different sorts of things that are not necessarily policies you can set up as an organization, right? There's not things you can't control when your employee is using public Wi-Fi or not, but you can train them on what to use for. You can't control your employee on how they function when they're traveling, right? So that's why you need to have training, and you need to have a culture of it. A lot of things too is in this training is you create a culture of people reporting cybercrime, right? That's one thing. If you accidentally clicked on a link, or if somebody called you pretending to be IT and you accidentally gave up information to them, it's embarrassing. An employee is going to be very embarrassed to go tell their supervisor, but it's exactly what they should do. They need to go tell their supervisor so that way they can notify IT and they can make the proper response to it. And then also, if you are seeing a cybersecurity attack, like if you receive phishing emails, you should let the rest of your team know and be like, hey, this is a phishing email. Because what a common strategy is, especially socially engineered, and they get so complex. We've seen clients that or companies that have gotten their account breached, and a cyber criminal literally read their emails for months to get to know the organization, to get to know the cadence before they committed the cyber crime. So the cyber crime is super intense, and they are well orchestrated, and they do their research, they do their due diligence. And so that way, so you need to create a culture. So part of the cybersecurity training is creating a culture of reporting things, right? One of the training programs in our cybersecurity training is that it makes a culture of like, hey, if you see something, if you accidentally click on something, if you're noticing a phishing email you're getting, report it. Let everyone else know. That way, if they get it, they don't click on it, right? Because one tactic is the cyber criminal will go after one employee, and if that person doesn't fall for the attack, they go to the next employee. And one tactic we've seen is the cyber criminal will go for one employee, and we've actually seen if the employee responds, let them know, hey, I'm not going to fall for it, the cyber criminal moves on to the next person. So that's another thing too, the cybersecurity training talks about is, hey, don't respond to the cyber criminal, right? Don't tell them, hey, I'm not going to click this, or I've reported you, because then they're going to get skittish and move either on to the next person or run away, right? Just report it to your boss, to your supervisor or your IT department. That's something really important that cybersecurity training tells you, right? Is how it's not so much, and the rest of these 15 tips we're going to talk about and these best practices, we're going to talk a lot about like organizational level things you can do to protect yourself. But what's so important as well, and this is why this is number one, the first thing you need to do is you need to have a culture of being aware of the attacks and then also sharing them as well. That way, because you can't have high level policies in place for everything, right? You need to have a culture of responding to things, especially since social engineering is such a common form of attacks. Awesome. Let's move on to the next one here. The next best practice we have for our clients and what we do internally is you should have MFA enabled on all accounts possible. So MFA, if you're unfamiliar with that term, is multi-factor authentication. Sometimes it's called two-factor authentication. And really what this is this gives you another level of security. If you're familiar with your bank, right? Every financial institution I've ever worked with or used requires MFA, where you get kind of that annoying text message code that you have to put in to the bank account after you enter your password. Now, this may seem cumbersome and kind of a pain to do, but it's so important. Studies have shown that you can increase your ability to ultimately protect your organizations by upwards of 60 to 70% by having MFA enabled in your organization. And we'll talk about password managers later. One way to help with MFA is to have password manager enabled, where it helps you manage the MFA, because MFA can get challenging, right? Because you can either do an authenticator app like Google or Microsoft, or you can get a text message code or an email code. One way to manage all that is a password manager. And we'll talk about that here in a few minutes of how you can use a password manager to manage MFA. But the rule here is on all available accounts, have MFA enabled. I can't stress how important that is. And when we start working with a new organization, 90% of the time, they don't have MFA enabled everywhere. They have it enabled on some things that are required, but not everywhere. This will greatly increase your online accounts by having MFA enabled. So your email accounts, your bank accounts, your file storage, your CRM, really any account, any cloud hosted account, especially having MFA enabled is super important, like I mentioned, because it will just make your accounts that much more secure. It is another step, right, that you have to do to protect your accounts. But I'll talk about in a few minutes, password managers, but it will greatly increase your overall security. And it's a deal breaker. We actually don't work with clients unless they're willing to enable MFA. It's part of our onboarding process that the clients we work with are like, hey, are you willing to have MFA enabled? Are you willing to have this best practice done for all your accounts? If you're not, us as an IT and cybersecurity provider, we don't feel comfortable serving clients unless they're at least doing that. It's too much liability for us. And it's also, honestly, we don't want to partner with clients that don't have that same ethos when it comes to cybersecurity, right? That same perspective of, hey, we got to take this seriously because it's affecting every organization, and it's super important. And things like MFA are a non-negotiable for working with us. So number 3 is, do you have data encryption on all computer hard drives? So data encryption is usually something that is built into the hard drive, but it's also something you can add on as an extra service in your computer, whether it's Macintosh or Windows. Encryption basically allows it. So if you're traveling with your laptop and somebody were to steal it, which does happen, whether you're traveling or in your office or a coffee shop or whatever, then if they pull out the hard drive, if it has data encryption on it, they cannot. It's virtually impossible to get into that hard drive. So this is important for 2 factors. Number 1, everyone I know has some sort of data on their computer, even if they're using cloud hosted services, right? I'm guilty of this as well, accidentally downloading something to my computer or downloading a sensitive file to my computer. So there's not one person I've worked with that has not downloaded some sort of sensitive information to their computer, even if you're completely cloud-based, even if you have all of your stuff in the cloud. The one exception of that is if you're like using a virtual desktop, but very few companies are using that, especially smaller organizations. And that's a very rare exception. Like I mentioned, most everyone, and we're all guilty of this, even if you use cloud storage, right? Even if you use Dropbox or Google Drive or OneDrive or Box or any of those file storage solutions, you know, just like me, that you and your staff accidentally or purposely download stuff to your computer so you can work offline. So encryption is still super important, because if somebody were to get access to that hard drive, they won't be able to access those documents that you've downloaded to your computer. Awesome. The next one here is number 4. Do all of your employees in your organization use corporate password managers? So let's talk about password managers for a second. I've worked in the IT industry for going over 5 years, and I've worked in technology related industry for almost 15 years in different roles and in a bunch of different industries. And I've never found a tool that saved me more time and that has just made my life easier and more secure than a password manager. And I feel like I should go work for these password managers because I love them so much. But my boss isn't listening to this webinar, because I love these password managers so much that it's just the coolest tool on the face of the planet. Whether you're an individual or whether you're a large company, password manager, I repeat, if you take anything out of this webinar, get a password manager. It will save you. It probably saves me 15 minutes a day, just not having to remember passwords. So let's talk about them for a second. A password manager is a vault. The one we love is 1Password. I've not found a better tool than 1Password. It's intuitive. It works well. It's super secure. It's so secure that Apple, that makes, Apple computers and the iPhone, their entire organization uses 1Password. They don't own 1Password. They just use it. They've literally signed up their entire staff for it, because it works so well, whether you're a PC user or a Mac user. And so what it does is it's a secure vault that allows you to ultimately save passwords, logins, bank account information, credit card information, social security numbers, anything that's super sensitive in this secure vault. And you might ask, well, how is this more secure than, having it on paper or whatever, or having it on my computer? Is because it's actually a 3-factor vault. So you have your password to log into it. You have MFA on top of that. And then you actually have an encryption code that only you have. That's a 16-character code that, or maybe it's 32-character code that you're supposed to print off and put in your safe, that only you can access this vault. It's more secure than the Chrome, or password managers in those web browsers, because those have been notorious for not necessarily being super secure. So ultimately, they're super secure, number one. You can also create unique passwords. So the key to password management, here's a couple of things to think about here. The key to password management is, number one, you want every single password to every single login you have to be unique. You should never reuse the same password. And once again, this is a big sticking point for organizations, because people do it all the time. They reuse the same password or a similar variation. Every password should be unique. And then it also should be complex. It should be 15 to 20 characters long. So if you have, like me and every other client we work with, hundreds of logins and passwords, whether it's personally and professionally, there's no way you can remember 20-character long password and unique for every login, right? Unless you're Rain Man. I think that's the only person on the planet that could remember all those variations, because now we're talking about literally hundreds of variations of passwords that are 20 characters long. So the only way you can do that is to have some sort of secure vault that generates these passwords. So these password managers, I literally don't know almost all of my passwords to my login accounts because the password manager knows it, it stores it, and I can easily retrieve them where it has a pop-up extension in my browser. I also have it on my phone where I can access all my passwords on my phone securely. And once again, I mentioned, if anything you get out of this webinar, go get 1Password. There has not been a better tool to not only increase security for your online accounts, but then also just to save you time, because, oh my gosh, before I had a password manager, I was always resetting passwords and how much time you waste. If I'm sharing a password, that's the cool thing about password managers as well, is you can have vaults in your organization where, hey, the marketing department gets access to all these logins, or the sales department gets access to these logins, or the accounting department gets access to all the bank logins, right? And then MFA can be built into the password manager. So the MFA code will pop up in the password managers. I cannot tell you, once again, how important a password manager is, and one of the greatest ways to increase your security and just save your organization time. Awesome. A quick, so number 5 here, we're going to jump into the 5th one here is, does your organization have a written information security policy on all employees have to adhere to? So policies and procedures, especially if you're in a regulated organization, like I mentioned, law firms, financial firms, medical organizations, marketing firms, all these organizations deal with a lot of PII, and they work with clients that deal with PII. Or if you work with government, if you work in government contracts, would be another one, is they're going to require some sort of information security policy. So number 1, you should just have it on file and created to be compliant. But then number 2, this is a document that you've outlined all of the standards for your organization when it comes to cybersecurity. And really, there's about 12 to 15 cybersecurity policies and procedures your organization should have in place. So it could be a termination policy, a bring your own device policy, an information security policy like this one. And all of these are super important because not only if you're in a regulated industry, they're going to require, right? If you're HIPAA regulated or FINRA or IRS or work with the government, you're going to be required to have these 12 to 15 policies. But then number 2, it's kind of a preventative, it's a proactive policy, because as you go through creating these cybersecurity policies, you kind of create the blueprint for how your IT and for how your organization should create, what's the standard for your cybersecurity, right? And so this information security policy, in addition to all the other policies I mentioned, is really your blueprint for cybersecurity, right? So these are the things that your IT department and your employees have to adhere to. And if your IT department or your employees don't adhere to them, there should be repercussions. And then also, if you're in a regulated organization, it's required, right? So if you don't have one of those, that's also something we do for our clients, and we can definitely help you with. And as a little side note, once again, we're going to jump into the rest of these cybersecurity tips, but if you need help with any of this, we can help you implement this, and we can also just do a free assessment. It's a 30-minute assessment that will go and see if there's any gaps in your cybersecurity. I just put the link in the chat, nwtecs.com/cyber. You can schedule a meeting with us right now where we can walk you through to see if there's any gaps in your cybersecurity approach and make sure you have all the best practices in place. Awesome. Let's move on to number 6. Are all your company emails in cloud storage regularly backed up? So a little misnomer that companies don't know is that if you are using Microsoft or Google or even any cloud hosted provider, in the terms and conditions, they actually require or recommend that you back up all of your emails and your cloud storage. And the reason for that is that they guarantee you, Microsoft, Google, AWS, they guarantee you that they're not going to lose your data. They double and triple redundancy in place, and they have it stored in multiple locations, geo redundancy. But if you were to accidentally delete an email or delete a file in your cloud storage, then it's gone after a certain period. They basically, negligent deletion is what they call it. Or if you have an employee, for whatever reason, accidentally deletes something or takes emails on their way out and deletes it if they leave on poor terms. So what they recommend is you back up your emails and your cloud storage. That way, you ultimately, if you accidentally delete something, then you have a backup of it. It also is, if you are more on the paranoid side of trusting those big Fortune 500 companies with all your data, it gives you a second layer of data security, right? Because the big companies, they're not perfect. We haven't really seen a whole lot of situations where a large company has lost some of these data or done it on a large scale. So it's not common. But if you're one of those people that, like to have a backup, in your office that you take home with you every night, or if you just want a secondary backup that you control that Google or Microsoft doesn't control, we highly recommend it. And then in addition, just negligent deletion is also is very important as well. Awesome. So number 7 is use your organization running simulated phishing campaigns to raise awareness. So this is something also that we include in our cybersecurity training that's super helpful. And I get tested as well. Every week I get fake phishing emails, kind of seems like a double negative. Basically what they are is they're phishing emails that are generated by our cybersecurity training to get me to just be aware of what the trend, to think before I click on an email, right? And to be like, hey, is this really my bank asking me to click on this email? And to basically think before I click. And our phishing simulator campaign, you click on the link and it says, oops, you've been phished, right? You've fallen for the test. And in our report, and in our portal, it actually shows everyone on the team that's clicked on a phishing email. So it's a great way to see weak spots in your organization for people that are just not aware. Maybe they haven't been trained on it, or maybe they need more training in the cybersecurity program. And so you can assign additional cybersecurity training to them if they're, falling for a lot of phishing emails. And then it's also kind of a competitive thing. I work for an IT company, so we're always looking at each other's score to be like, oh, did you fall for the recent phishing emails? How did you do on your recent cybersecurity test? And it's something that kind of is gamifying, it's making a game out of something that's super important. So to create some sort of competition in the organization to be like, hey, you know what? I don't want to be the person with a low score. And I definitely don't want to be the person clicking on phishing emails, because then my boss is going to be like, man, is Taylor really being careful, right? When he looks on emails, is he going to be our cybersecurity weakest link? And so it creates that awareness, it creates that culture, and also support too. We don't want to create a culture that's necessarily everyone feel like they're in fear all the time. And that's why the training is important, right? To give people the confidence and the vigilance to know what to look for and what not to look for. But then also the testing to follow through. That way people are on their toes, where they're like, they just take a second before they click on something, right? Because they don't want to be caught in that phishing email and fall for that test. Awesome. Number 8 is, are all your workstations or servers containing important data regularly backed up? So this is something that, so like we talked about, especially for servers, right? If you still have servers, it should be regularly backed up. And there's lots of different backup strategies depending on your organization. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. And ultimately, there's a lot of different strategies. But if you have data on your computers, they should be backed up. They should be encrypted and backed up, especially servers. Judy, thanks for the question. Yes, we will be sharing the presentation and the recording, so you can get it afterwards. Ultimately, super important. Number 8 is regularly back up all your workstations and servers. Number 9 is, do all your computers in your organization have antivirus installed? I've heard it said that the best antivirus is the one you use and regularly update. And there's quite a few antiviruses out there that we like and that we use. And we have one that we implement for our clients. But the key is have it installed on all of your workstations and servers, and then make sure it's up to date, because there's constantly new viruses out there. And if the antivirus isn't up to date, it's not going to be aware of the new ones. So making sure it's up to date, and your IT department or IT vendor making sure that they're updating it regularly. Number 10, does your organization carry cybersecurity insurance? So this is something that is really important for a couple reasons. So if you're in those organizations that deal with PII, right? Law firms, financial firms, medical organizations, marketing agencies, you are involved or handling the most PII out of most industries. So this is super important because you're just at the greatest risk of being breached, because you are going to be targeted more than other organizations. If you're a construction firm or a landscaping company or an electrical engineering company or an architect firm, you may not have as much PII. You still have cybersecurity risk, right? And most of the cybersecurity attacks out there have a socially engineered element, but they're also automated. So, they target everyone. They do target a lot of highly regulated organizations in particular, just because they have so much sensitive data and it's a treasure trove of data for them. But all organizations are at risk. But really, the ones that are the most important to have this is those highly regulated organizations. So cybersecurity insurance, how much should you have? What I've seen and what we've done our research is you should have $250 for every piece of, basically for every contact and related information you have in your organization. So if you have 1,000 clients, worth of data, you should have $250,000 worth of cybersecurity in place. Now, some organizations should have more than that, and to reach out to your insurance provider, or you can reach out to us and we can point you in the right direction for finding cybersecurity insurance. But ultimately, you should have $250 per contact is kind of the industry standard per piece of sensitive information. And so this, having a cybersecurity breach is not good, right? Ultimately, one of the biggest costs of cybersecurity breach is just the disruption in your business, right? The downtime of malware. We've seen organizations that have been down for weeks because of a cybersecurity breach. And you've seen, even large companies be down for a couple of days, right? And that can cost your organization thousands of dollars plus. And so cybersecurity insurance can help with that. They can help with some recouping some of those costs, but they can also help with the mitigation, right? Whether it's whether you need to hire a lawyer or hire an IT specialist or a cybersecurity organization to help you navigate that. Awesome. Once again, if you want help with all of this, please reach out to us, nwtecs.com/cyber. We can do a free assessment, talk about your specific organization, and see if you have all these things in place, and see if there's any gaps in your cybersecurity program. Awesome. Let's move on to number 11. Do you have an annual security risk assessment process? So this is also something that's required for every single regulated organization we work with. So these 15 practices are just best practices for every organization, but they are also things that are required of organizations that are either SOC 1 or 2 required, the NIST framework, the IRS safeguarding standards, HIPAA requirements. Virtually all of these 15 best practices fall under this. And an annual security risk assessment is one of the most important ones. So this is an annual test where you benchmark ongoing, how are you doing with your cybersecurity program? Are you actually fulfilling all the things you set out to do? So if you've created a bunch of policies and procedures for saying, here's how we're going to operate, the annual security risk assessment benchmarks it and says, hey, are we doing everything we promised to do, right? Or do we have MFA enabled? Are we using a password manager? Do we have antivirus installed? Or do we have a regular backup strategy, to name a few, right? And that annual risk assessment has an ongoing document where you do a self-assessment, or you have a company like ours help you do that assessment in seeing if you're actually doing all those. It does two things. First, it brings up the gaps in your organization, right? Because your technology is going to change. You're going to use new tools. You're going to move into new locations. And so that ongoing testing will bring up gaps to help you be aware of it. And then number two, it's a public facing document that if you were to get audited or have a cybersecurity questionnaire audit, you can give them saying, hey, every year we're doing our cybersecurity assessment. We're doing our due diligence, and we have this ongoing thing, which I mentioned is required by pretty much every single regulatory framework. So two important reasons. Number one, you have your ongoing benchmark to know how you're doing as an organization. And then number two, it's a public facing document that you can give and show, hey, we're doing our due diligence and we're doing the things we need to do. Here's how we're doing with our cybersecurity assessment. Awesome. Number 12 is, do you have a system to track security incidences? So this is really important because of a couple things. Like I mentioned, a lot of the socially engineered attacks are multifaceted, right? Or multi-factored, where you have a cyber criminal trying to penetrate your organization from a couple different directions. So if you have a system where people are reporting into this system recent suspected breaches or suspicious activity, it can make the IT department and the rest of your team aware of these incidences. It's also something that's usually required in a regulatory process, a security protocol or questionnaire audit. So super important to have that, to have some sort of system that people are reporting incidences to. Number 13 is, if you get audited, do you have a process to achieve success in the audit? So this is really all around. Especially if you're a financial firm, medical organization, a law firm, work with the government in any shape or form, IRS, right, a CPA firm, or a law firm, there's chances are you are probably under some sort of regulatory requirement and you may get audited in the future. So is your IT team or your IT provider ready to help you take through a cybersecurity audit? That's a big question, especially for those highly regulated organizations. Are you ready to complete an audit? Some of our clients, have already gone audited and we've helped them get through it. And then some of them want to be prepared for it, right? So moving forward, they want to make sure, especially if they're in one of those regulated organizations, they're prepared to complete an audit. Awesome. Let's move on to the 14, and then we are going to get into some Q&A and questions here. So have you reviewed your specific industry data regulatory requirements? So if you are, like I mentioned, any regulated organizations, have you reviewed, if you're a CPA firm, have you reviewed the IRS safeguarding standards? If you're a financial firm, have you reviewed the FTC's or FINRA's or SEC's safeguarding standards? If you're a medical organization, have you reviewed the HIPAA data security requirements? And this is super important. This is something that we help our clients with, depending on what organization they're in, is actually going through and saying, hey, what is required of you? That way, if you get an audit, you can pass with flying colors. You don't have to pay a huge fine or have other disciplinary actions against you. So super important. Number 15 is, are you alerted when suspicious activity occurs in your organization? So this is something we have a lot of tools in place for our organization. We do for our clients as well. Is, for example, a couple months ago, one of our engineers reached out to me and said, hey, Taylor, do you know why somebody in Eastern Europe is trying to log into your Microsoft 365 account? This is a true story. Kevin, one of our engineers, asked me that. And I'm like, no, I'm not in Eastern Europe right now. There should be no reason why that's logging in. And so they weren't able to get in because I have multi-factor authentication set up and I have multiple security setups. The person wasn't able to get in. And then in addition to that, Kevin, or one of our senior engineers, was able to put in additional security protocols to even make it even more locked down and harder to get into my account specifically. So that's just one example of being alerted when you have suspicious activity, and having regular, maybe vulnerability scans in place of your firewall, or having alerts in place for Microsoft 365. So awesome. These are the 15 things. And once again, the reason why we put these things in place is for, number one, giving you the best cybersecurity practices in place. And number two, making sure you pass an audit. Before we jump into cybersecurity questions you guys all have, make sure, once again, you can click on the link in the chat, nwtecs.com/cyber, if you want a free assessment from us. Awesome. Let's talk about some Q&A here. So a couple questions here is Elaine asks, are your slides going to be available after the download? Yes, they are. We'll send out a recording of the webinar and also the slides as well. Some of the interesting questions we received when you all submitted your Q&A, in the registration form, was around the current breaches that have occurred. So I want to talk for a few minutes around what we can learn from those current breaches and what are things you can do. So let's first talk about actually one that happened last year, or I guess it was maybe in 2019, was the Twitter breach. If you remember that, President Barack Obama, Elon Musk, Kim Kardashian, all these celebrities got their Twitter account breached. And what happened was a 17-year-old kid and a 15-year-old kid pretended to be Twitter's IT department and literally went and called every single or a couple hundred Twitter employees and said, hey, this is IT. I need you to log into this website real quick, and I need to update something on your computer. And they did it. They called hundreds of employees, and eventually a couple employees fell for it and went to the website, sense of urgency, I'm sure. And, and ultimately just, and feeling rushed and like, sure, okay, IT, I'll do whatever you say. They went to the website and got these Twitter employees' credentials, and then went and logged out and basically reset all the passwords for all these famous people, and then proceeded to perform a Bitcoin scam, which in hindsight, a 15-year-old and a 17-year-old, that wasn't really the most ingenious scam. They could literally have caused a potentially like a war or a major security incident. Thank God that didn't happen. Thankfully, they were just trying to go for get a quick buck, which they were successful. They got people to actually send Bitcoin to these accounts because President Barack Obama said, hey, if you send me Bitcoin, I'll send you back too. A very typical scam that happens all the time, which you've seen probably with, the Nigerian prince that says, hey, I'll send you $1 million, but you have to send me $1,000 first or whatever. So what to be learned here is ultimately the social engineering aspect of it, right? So these kids pretended to call up all these, or pretended to be Twitter's IT department, and called up Twitter employees to get access to their accounts. So phone scams is something we see all the time. And something you should be really aware of, that phone scams are actually something that are one of the more successful scams out there is phone scams. And you should be aware of that. When somebody's impersonating your bank or your employer or the IT department, be super aware of people calling you. It's not just emails, right? It's not just fake emails or phishing emails. It's phone calls as well, or text messages. Oh my gosh, we've seen a ton of text message scams. I just got one the other week where it was somebody trying to be my internet provider or my phone provider, which I don't have T-Mobile, but they're saying, hey, it's T-Mobile, click on this link. My mother sent me one a couple days ago and says, hey, you just sent $1,000 through PayPal. Click on this link to receive it or whatever. And she's like, is this real? And I responded to her, I'm like, no, mom, that's a scam. Don't click on the link. So things like that, right? There's so many different scams out there, and a lot of them are socially engineered. A couple of the other ones we can learn from are one from EA Games was recently scammed in the past probably 12 months. A large gaming company where somebody had a VPN access that was a couple years old, and that was shared with a couple people. and no one had reset the password. They kind of forgot about the VPN access. The criminals were able to get the VPN access into their server and break into their server. Something that could have been probably solved with a password manager, right? Having a log of all the passwords out there, making sure they're secure, making sure they're shut down if they're not used. The other probably notable ones are the JBS, the Meat Processing Organization, and Colonial Pipelines. Both of those were ransomware attacks. And for small organizations, the most ransomware we see out there is usually through phishing attacks. Theirs were a little more sophisticated, where they use contractor, like a third-party contractor, to get into their organization, and so they're a little bit more nuanced and a lot more sophisticated than what we see for small organizations. But what you can learn in a small organization is that you should ultimately be aware of phishing attacks. Right, that's one of the most common ways ransomware gets on people's computers. Is they click on a phishing email and they download a file, or they're on the web and they download something, and the ransomware then corrupts their infrastructure. So awesome. Those are kind of the most notable stories out there. If there's any other questions, please submit in the chat. It looks like we've answered most of the questions out there. So thank you all for joining the webinar today. If you need help with a cybersecurity assessment, please reach out to us, nwtecs.com/cyber. We'd be happy to take you through an assessment to see if there's any gaps in your security process, and we can make sure you have the best cybersecurity in place. If you just have any other questions for us in general, just feel free to reach out to us at hello@nwtecs.com. We really want to be evangelists for having the best, and just really encouraging people to have the best cybersecurity out there, because really it is something that affects us all, right? And if we can all be vigilant as a society and small businesses, we can better combat cybersecurity criminals and put them out of business, right? That's the goal. So thanks everyone for joining us today. I hope it was of extreme value. Thanks for spending time with us and really learning how to best protect your organization. Feel free to reach out to us once again, nwtecs.com or nwtecs/cyber, and happy to set up that assessment. Once again, thanks so much, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day.